Hi there, welcome back. Today I'm going to be working on these 4 camellia that I've selected from a nursery, and I'm going to be styling them as a bunjin or literati style bonsai. The camellias that I've chosen have a little bit of interesting movement. One of the problems with camellia as bonsai is that once the branch has lignified, so if it's become woody, it snaps incredibly easily. So it's quite difficult to put a lot of bends in them, but gentle bends for a bunjin style is certainly possible. But I've looked for material that is fairly thin, that can still be shaped a little bit, and I've also looked for something that already had a little bit of movement in it, so hopefully I can just enhance that movement in the styling process. You do want to look for camellia species or varieties that have smaller flowers, as small a flower as possible, and also a flower that is a simple flower, so you get various flower forms. These also have very much smaller leaves. These are Camellia sasanquas specifically, and I've got some of the varieties that I've chosen is Nancy van Heerden. Let's see what else is there. This is Setsugeka. When you have material that has never been worked on as bonsai before, so in other words, it's in a container with some kind of potting soil mix of whatever kind, and the tree is still in its rough form, so no styling has taken place. The first step is going to be to style the tree and then move over to cleaning the root ball and repotting the tree. The reason for this is that securing the tree into the container, reducing the root ball, securing the tree, chopsticking your soil in your fresh bonsai mix, whatever you're using, and then styling the tree will unsettle it, because you're going to be applying wire, you're going to be making different bends, and this is going to move the tree around in the container. So it's best to do the styling first and then to do the repotting. Now you need to understand the species that you're working with as well. Not all species is it advisable to do a styling and a repot at the same time. But in fact, with camellias, it is quite advisable to do that, because you, of course, by reducing the foliage mass, you're reducing the demand for nutrients, for water to flow into the tree, and which complements the fact that you're now going to be repotting the tree, so therefore reducing the root ball. First thing I'm going to do is just start on a single tree. And then I'm going to just view it from various angles and decide what growth I don't want to keep in the design. When you sit down with a tree that hasn't been worked on before and is still in its nursery bag, you want to start with exposing a little bit of the root system to see if there's any particular side, because the first objective here would be to decide where your front is going to be. And in order to do that, it does help to see if there's a side of the nabari, the root system, that looks better than another side, or perhaps a fault, some root emerging from the soil, some ugly thing. So you want to look at that first, and to do that, I'm just going to cut the container a little bit lower and start reducing some of the soil at the surface. And I'm just using a pair of angled tweezers to expose the top of the roots. And you're wanting to go down a ways until you see the first major roots before you stop. So I'm starting to get a bit of trunk flare in this area, and then some heavier roots here. So this is about as low as I really think I need to go on the trunk. A little bit of trunk flare is really nice. And now we need to look at, so we need to turn the tree around different angles. And also, obviously, don't be scared of changing the angle completely of the planting angle of the tree. And now you're looking for something with interesting movement, depending on the style that you're wanting to implement or to style the tree in. You may need branches lower down, or maybe not. In our case, with the bunjin style, you don't want branches lower down on the trunk. And I don't really want a twin trunk. And besides that, this split in the trunk is also quite high up. So I'm looking at how the tree continues and looking for a little bit of taper. And in this tree, the trunk does taper on this side better, and I'll show that to you. So I think for what I'm planning on doing, which is a bunjin style, where I want some taper. I mean, bunjin is all about the line of the trunk, very important. This trunk is still flexible enough to put some bends in, albeit that I'll have to use fairly heavy aluminium wire. But this one does also give me a nice taper up into this if I want to use this here. And then in which case I'll eliminate this branch going off to the side and work with the right hand side. These lower branches will be removed as well. I won't have any use for those in the style for this tree. So to cut off this lower section or this branch, I'm just going to do a rough cut with the root cutter and set that aside, and then I'm going to use a branch cutter to reduce this knob. And now with Camellia, you need to understand that they don't have a very thick callus, so you don't want to make a concave cut. You do want it to be slightly shaped, in fact, at least flat, but definitely not cupped. So what I'm going to do later on is I will take a blade, and once the styling is finished, I will take a blade and clean this cut again and then seal it with Topgen sealer, which will help promote callus formation, but also effectively seal in moisture and protect the open wound that I've created. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to be needing these lower branches, so I'm just going to cut those off. And I'm also going to change the direction of the trunk line by cutting this top section off. So I'm going to be making my tree with this portion. I might reduce the length here, but let me first finish the trunk. Yeah, I just want to clean this cut and give it a really good, nice, sharp cut. And I'm using grafting knife for that. And then I'm going to seal that cut with Topgen sealer. I like to apply it with a brush. It's water-based, so it's easy then just to go afterwards and clean the brush with water. And now this will make sure that the cut is protected and that it can start callousing. Because the bark of Camellia is so thin, it's very easily scraped off by when you apply wire. And so what I'm going to be doing is I've soaked some raffia, and I'm going to apply the raffia to the branches or to the trunk of the tree, and this is going to protect the bark when I apply the wire. It doesn't have to be terribly tight, obviously tight enough that it's not going to move around. But it's not, again, as I mentioned, it's the purpose of applying this raffia is just to protect the trunk. So it's really just a protective layer rather than holding the trunk together or the fibers together, so to speak, as a means to prevent it from splitting when bends are applied to it. So you just want to apply the raffia in such a way that you get a decent amount of overlap, just so that there's nothing exposed. With the raffia now applied, I can move on to the next step, because the trunk is going to be nicely protected from the wire. So I can now move to the next step and apply a heavier gauge of aluminium wire so that I can put some bends into this trunk. Now what you can of course do is you can either apply a single strand of wire, or you can apply 2 strands of wire. So if you're using one, then it would need to be fairly thick, of course. Otherwise, if you're using 2 and you space them apart, there's certain advantages that also gives you. So I'm going to use, on this one, I'm going to use 2 wires, and they're going to run in parallel to one another. The second wire is going to run the full length of the tree. So it helps to support the first wire, but I want to also take this one further up into the apex of the tree as well. So that's where it will terminate. So as I mentioned, this wire is going to run parallel, but just spaced apart to the first wire that I applied. And also this is better for brittle, to wire this way is also better for brittle trees, because it supports those sections between the coils better as well. So if, depending on how you're going to put the bend in, if you bend at a specific spot that's not supported, it's very inclined to, or likely to, snap at that particular point. So this wire just serves to support that as well. So try and keep your curves as constant, or the angles as constant as possible. You should always try and make your bends on the inside of a curve of wire. So in other words, if you want to bend this in this way, down like this, then there's wire to support the outside of that bend. If there's nothing to support there, it definitely has a greater tendency to snap. So now you want to, if there's any existing curves in the trunk, you want to enhance that. And also, now that generally Camellia will start, you will see cracks starting to form in the branch, in the trunk that you're bending, or in the portion of plant that you're bending. But with raffia now preventing that, you need to listen very carefully for cracks, or start and also get a sense for the feel of where you're taking it maybe just a little bit too far, and then stop before you get to that point. If you put fairly exaggerated curves in, it will seem maybe a little bit exaggerated now, but as the trunk thickens as well, you're going to find that will change, and those curves will be softened. So the first tree is now finished. I've put in lots of bends, enhanced some of the natural bends. There was, if you remember, the trunk that had split off from the tree. There was a scar, or there will be a scar for some time on the tree as a result of that. I've actually styled the tree with this scar in the back, and so this is the front of the tree that you're viewing now from your angle. And this planting angle is also fine. One could enhance the movement to the right by tilting the angle further over, tilting the planting angle more. I don't really think it's necessary. I was able to get some gentle bends. Now, as I mentioned to you already, if you're wanting to have fairly sharp bends in the trunk, then the Camellia is not really going to allow you to do that at this point in time. It will snap. And so you have to use much younger material, much thinner material. Well, actually, thinner is not really going to help you. It needs to be younger, because the moment it becomes lignified or woody, it's just going to snap. So this is about the most, so it is fairly sweeping kind of movements. It's not drastic, but I think that lends itself well to the style of the tree as well, or the species as well. These leaves are now showing, the back side of the leaves is now showing towards the sun. There isn't really much that I can do about that. They may get a little bit of sunburn, but it's only spring now, so the sun is going to be a little bit weaker anyway, so I don't think it's too much of a problem. And Then over the years, as the tree develops, obviously the wire can then be removed in the raffia, and then the nice smooth bark, that greyish colour of camellias, can be exposed, and then we'll obviously build up some ramification in these branches. But the idea is that it's a bunjin style, so it's going to be fairly sparse, but I think it's going to be great when you've got individual flowers or single flowers on the tree at a time. If I remember correctly, this flower is a kind of a cerise pink, simple flower. So very happy with the way this one turned out, and on to the next one. I've now finished styling the 4 camellias. I'm just going to run through a few things that I picked up and learnt as I was going through the process that I can now share with you, and then you can also learn from that. In the first tree that I styled, I had 2 wires running in parallel around the trunk. And that worked very nicely because it halved the distance between the 2 wires of area that was not supported. And given that the camellia is very brittle, it's actually really advisable to have that second wire in there, because that definitely helped to prevent the splitting or the cracking, because on one of the other trees I didn't apply the wire and I found that there was quite a number of splits in it. So I definitely encourage you to use double wire, and don't place the wires. Normally we would run the wire right next to the first wire, but in this case you want to create spacing, so keep the angles correct, but and obviously always keep your wire nice and tight against the trunk, but make sure that you have a equal distance between them, and use a second wire, not so much in order to make the bends, although obviously that is its primary function, but to prevent splitting or cracking in the trunk when you bend it. When you are removing branches or secondary trunks or whatever, making large cuts, don't cut all the way down to the trunk flush and trim it with a blade and all of that, because that area actually becomes very susceptible to breaking if you try and put a bend in that area. That area is definitely going to break. So what I would rather, and what I did in the latter trees that I styled, was I allowed a shoulder or stub to remain, and then I wired in that area, and then the idea will be that when the wire comes off, and obviously by then the shape will be kept by the tree, but then I can reduce and work the cut properly and get it to callus over. When you're creating these bends, very often you'll find that when you bend the trunk, there's a separation between the wire and the trunk. And the way to avoid that is to bend it. So in other words, if the wire is going around clockwise, then you need to bend or twist the trunk as you're bending it down. You're twisting it in a clockwise fashion, and this actually helps to prevent breaks, but it also keeps the wire nice and tight against the trunk as well, and that of course itself is going to help reduce or prevent breaks as well. On this tree there were some interesting I say interesting, I mean ugly roots that were at the surface, and I removed those. And when I did the styling of the tree, I kept the scars that were created by the removal of that root in mind, and I kept it to the back. With bunjin style, you do want to ensure, specifically in a case like this, so with any deciduous materials, at least this is my preference, is not to show any scars. So although it will heal over eventually, it will take some time with Camellia. They are not very fast healers. They don't hide the scars very easily. So try to keep those areas to the back of the tree, and then you won't see them. Of course, this is different with pines and junipers, where maybe that shari or the dead area could be used as part of the design of the tree to create character in the form of shari and jin. But in the case of a tree like this, you don't want to show any scars because that will blemish the trunk. And one of the attractive features of Camellia is the fact that they have a very beautiful, smooth grey bark. Now, my last comment is really pertaining to styling of the trees. With bunjin style, as I mentioned earlier, the emphasis is on the trunk and the trunk line. So you want some taper, but it shouldn't be too dramatic. And all of these trunks really embody that sort of characteristic. So there's no abrupt changes in trunk girth. But you want some subtle changes of direction and movement in the trunks. It should be interesting, so your eye follows the line of the trunk up into the apical area. And so you want some bends, some twists, some forward and backward movement, some up and down, and this just adds interest to the tree. So that's all very important. Try not to get any straight sections or any areas which would be very easy to create with an area like this. You don't want to get any lines parallel to the ground. Be careful of that. But otherwise, bunjin style is a very free style, and it's a very sort of exhilarating, freeing sort of style. So enjoy yourself. The other thing that you need to remember about styling camellias is that they don't readily form a high degree of ramification. So they're grown specifically for their flowers. And so in fact, I think that the bunjin style is actually quite suited to them because you're not really going to get a lot of ramification. And the emphasis is going to be on the flowers, of course, and the beautiful green, deep bottle green leaves that you get on the tree too. So I think that the styling of the Camellia in bunjin style is actually great. The next step of the work will be to remove all the soil, this potting mix, and put the trees into development containers. So I'm now going to just strip away as much of the soil as I can. Camellias very readily form new roots. So don't be too conservative in keeping a lot of roots, because they actually do form roots very easily. So I'm going to reduce the root ball, then I'm going to take the trees outside and wash them off with water, get rid of as much of the soil as I can, and then go over to potting them up into their new containers. Just using a root sickle, I'm going to just cut through these roots. So you can remove more of the soil. I'm using angled tweezers. But in fact, I actually like to, when you get to this stage, to actually just use a good solid jet of water to remove the rest of the soil. This mechanical action of removing the soil with the root hook or something can actually remove quite a bit of root. So water is less, how can I say, invasive, intrusive, destructive, I don't know. So actually I'm going to leave a lot of this still there, and then I'll wash it off, and then what needs to be reduced further in order to get it to fit into the container, I'll do that then. So I'm just going to put this aside and do the others. We have dramatically reduced the amount of foliage on the tree, and so we can be quite aggressive with the root system as well. Just remember that you need to try and keep it in a balance. You can do a lot, they can tolerate a lot, camellias, but you do need to balance it. So if you do remove a lot of foliage, you can remove a lot of roots, but if you keep a lot of foliage, you need to be a lot more conservative with the amount of roots that you can remove. So with the trees washed and the root balls a lot smaller now and cleaned of the old potting soil, I'm now going to go ahead and prepare my containers with drainage mesh and tie-down wires. I'm using these Maruku development pots. Bear in mind that ultimately these trees need to go into very shallow bunjin type containers. Now, given that they like a little bit more moisture, it's not going to be as shallow as some bunjin containers, but nevertheless I'm going to be using these containers at the moment because they have a very good ratio of width to the height. The depth, the height is a lot shallower and a little bit more like what the trees will actually be planted into eventually. But this will still give them some chance to develop further. Make sure that you cut the drainage mesh of a size that's sufficient to entirely cover the hole. The whole point is that growing media can't fall through, so make sure that it overlaps nicely. Now I'm going to use some aluminium wire to secure the mesh over the hole, and just give it a nice 90-degree angle. Check the distance so that the wire is going to be snug on the opposite side of the hole. We don't want there to be any movement of the mesh once it's been put in. And then we can cut it on the reverse side. Okay, now I'm going to put my wires in that I'm going to use to secure the trees. Now there's only 2 holes at the bottom of these containers, but that's fine. I'm going to use 2 separate wires, and this will make sure or ensure that my tree is not going to be able to move around once potted, get knocked off for whatever reason. That's a finished container there. Now I'm just going to continue working this root ball and eliminate some of these roots that are going to make it difficult for the tree to fit into the container. Roots that are growing out of the top of the of any main roots. I'm going to show you. Yeah. Those can be cut off, and any roots that are growing directly down can also be eliminated. Now I'm going to be using Kanuma for Camellia. They love, it's an acid, it's very acidic soil, it's very soft. I'm putting a fairly coarse layer at the bottom. This is my drainage layer, and this will promote a more even drying through the vertical column of the media of the container. And then on top of that I'm going to put a finer or a smaller particle. Now because Kanuma is so soft, it's very porous, and so it holds a lot of water. It's very water retentive, but it's also soft, so it's a little bit harder than perlite, but it's certainly softer than akadama. And so you need to be very careful when working with it. You don't want to work too much with it because otherwise you're going to create a lot of dust. So let's just get the planting angle correct, and then I can secure it with my wire. And now I can just fill that up, the remaining space, with more media. Finally, just gently work this, make sure that there's no gaps between the particles of the soil. So just gently work this with a chopstick or some other similar implement, and but try not to over chopstick because it will crush the growing media. So you can just gently, there's no real major undercuts in the root system, so it's not too much to worry about there. It's always a good idea to give the trees a very thorough watering after you've repotted them, especially when you're using something like a Kanuma, because it does produce dust very easily. So just that little bit of chopsticking would have produced some dust. And then obviously the particles of growing media themselves have some dust on them as well. So as you can see, that yellow dust that's coming out of the bottom there. Now the final step in this process is going to be to put some top dressing on, and I have got a video which I'll put the link in for now, of how to make top dressing. And top dressing is really just to stabilize this growing medium now, because obviously when you water it, it's going to shift around because it's brand new and it's incredibly loose. There's no surface rooting that's binding it together. So the sphagnum moss, the chopped sphagnum moss, just creates a sort of a bind, keeps it together, protects it, and also encourages, because it keeps a layer of moisture near the surface, it encourages rooting to form right at the surface of the container. So we're going to apply this now. I find the easiest way to apply the sphagnum moss is to put a little bit of it very wet, and put a little bit of it in my hand, and then just sort of slap it on to the surface. So it's mainly around the area close to the trunk that we're interested in. It shouldn't be too thick a layer. Should just create a layer, you know, so not too thick, probably a few millimeters, maybe no more than around 5 millimeters thick, and then that is done. So I'm now done with the styling and repotting of these camellias. And if you don't have camellia in your collection, I would encourage you to get a couple. They really do make wonderful flowering bonsai trees, can be appreciated throughout the year because they have beautiful leaves, they have a beautiful bark, smooth grey bark. And of course then in spring, depending on which variety of Camellia, Chinensis, Sasanqua, or Japonica, and there's a few others depending on which ones you get. Usually the flowering is late winter, early spring, and so you'll be rewarded with really amazing flowers. So I hope that you've enjoyed this workshop with me. I hope to see you again next Friday when I release a new video. If you haven't done so yet, please do like and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, take care. Goodbye.